Women are evil. Could this provocative statement summarize one of the most controversial thoughts of the legendary psychoanalyst Carl Jung? Behind his theories of the collective unconscious and universal archetypes lies a vision of the female psyche that would shock many of his modern followers. Jung believed that women carried within them psychic forces capable of creating and destroying entire civilizations. Is this ancient wisdom, or merely the reflection of a man trapped in the prejudices of his time? What happens when we explore the shadow side of Jungian psychology? And why do his theories about the feminine continue to provoke such discomfort, fascination, and heated debates to this day? Get ready to question everything you thought you knew about the human mind. At the core of Jung's most controversial ideas about women lies his revolutionary concept of psychological complementarity. According to Jung, every man carries within himself a feminine aspect of his unconscious psyche, the anima, while every woman possesses a masculine counterpart, the animus. This isn't simply about biological differences or social roles. It speaks to the fundamental structure of the human soul itself. The anima, Jung claimed, manifests in men as their inner feminine principle. She appears in dreams and fantasies as a seductive figure, a nurturing mother, a wise guide, or sometimes as a destructive temptress. The anima represents everything the male consciousness denies in itself: emotionality, sensitivity, and connection to the unconscious depths. When undeveloped or rejected, she becomes a source of irrational moods, emotional outbursts, and profound discontent that many men struggle to understand within themselves. But it was Jung's theory of the animus, the masculine element in women, that raised far more eyebrows. Unlike the anima, which typically appears as a singular feminine figure in men's dreams, Jung observed that the animus often manifests as multiple male figures or a collective entity in women's dreams. He described it as representing logos, rationality, judgment in a woman's psyche, in contrast to her inherent eros, relatedness, emotional connection. Jung suggested that when a woman's animus remains undeveloped, it manifests as rigid opinions, cutting criticism, and an aggressive intellectualism disconnected from emotional reality. An undeveloped animus could make women dogmatic, argumentative, and coldly rational in ways that betrayed their deeper feminine nature. This was the source of what Jung saw as women's capacity for a particular kind of unconscious destructiveness, not moral evil, but a psychological distortion resulting from inner imbalance. A woman possessed by the animus is always in danger of losing her femininity, Jung wrote in one particularly contentious passage. He suggested that modern women faced a unique psychological crisis as they entered traditionally masculine domains, without the proper integration of their animus energies. This, he believed, could lead to psychological inflation, where a woman might identify too strongly with masculine consciousness at the expense of her deeper feminine wisdom. What makes these ideas still inflammatory today is how they challenge contemporary views on gender identity. Jung wasn't speaking merely about social roles, but about psychological structures he believed were innate and archetypal. For him, true psychological health meant recognizing and integrating these contrasexual aspects while maintaining one's primary gender identity, a view that seems simultaneously progressive and regressive by modern standards. Jung's clinical observations led him to believe that the psychic development of women differed fundamentally from that of men. Where men might repress emotions and intuitive knowledge, Jung observed that some women tended to repress their capacity for independent thought, critical judgment, and spiritual authority. The integration of these repressed elements represented different psychological challenges for each gender. Modern Jungian analysts have worked to separate the culturally conditioned aspects of Jung's observations from the deeper psychological insights they contain. Many now interpret the anima and animus not as rigid gender stereotypes, but as psychological energies available to all humans, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. Yet Jung's original formulations remain challenging precisely because they suggest that psychological wholeness might look different for men and women. Perhaps most provocatively, Jung believed that a woman's relationship with her animus determined much of her impact on the world. Those who projected an unintegrated animus onto men could be destructively critical or subservient to male authority figures. Those who successfully integrated their animus gained access to spiritual and intellectual gifts while maintaining their feminine consciousness. In other words, Jung didn't see women as inherently evil, but he did believe they possess specific psychological vulnerabilities that, left unaddressed, could manifest as particularly destructive patterns. What's remarkable is how Jung's patients often reported experiencing profound relief upon working with these concepts. Women who had struggled with persistent negative thought patterns, harsh self-criticism, or difficulties with male authority figures found that understanding the animus helped them separate these internal dynamics from their authentic selves. Men discovered that acknowledging their anima allowed them access to emotional depths and intuitive wisdom they had previously denied. The question remains: was Jung describing transcultural psychological truths about men and women, or was he simply reflecting the gender arrangements of early 20th century Europe? The answer likely contains elements of both. His observations emerged from thousands of hours of clinical work with patients whose suffering often connected to gender-related psychological conflicts. Yet Jung's framing of these dynamics inevitably bears the stamp of his cultural moment. Fact he himself would likely acknowledge, given his emphasis on how consciousness is shaped by its historical context. When Jung spoke about the eternal feminine, he ventured into territory that continues to provoke intense debate. His concept of feminine archetypes, powerful symbolic patterns that he believed were embedded in the collective unconscious of humanity, raises profound questions about the nature of gender differences. Are there genuinely universal feminine qualities that transcend time and culture, or was Jung simply elevating Western cultural stereotypes to the status of cosmic truths? For Jung, the archetypal feminine manifested in several primary forms: the mother, the maiden, the anima, and the wise woman or crone. These weren't merely social roles, but representations of fundamental energies he believed shaped human experience. Across cultures, the mother archetype embodied nurturing, protection, and fertility, but also possessed a destructive aspect in her potential to devour, entrap, or overwhelm. The maiden represented innocence, new beginnings, and transformation. The anima appeared as the mediator between conscious and unconscious realms. And the wise woman carried the feminine expression of wisdom, intuition, and spiritual knowledge. The archetype of the feminine exists in men as well as in women, Jung wrote, though its expression in women is direct, while in men it is indirect. This statement captures both the revolutionary and problematic aspects of his thinking. On one hand, Jung acknowledged the presence of feminine principles in all humans, regardless of gender. On the other, he maintained essential differences in how these principles manifested based on biological sex, a position many contemporary thinkers find reductionist. One of Jung's most challenging assertions was that women maintain a more natural connection to the unconscious realm than men. He believed women possessed a particular psychological capacity for containing and transforming unconscious content, what he called feminine containment. This special relationship to the unconscious, Jung suggested, gave women unique spiritual capacities, but also exposed them to particular psychological dangers when they abandoned this natural function to pursue consciousness in traditionally masculine ways. Jung's female contemporaries had complicated reactions to these ideas. Some found his acknowledgement of feminine wisdom and spiritual authority liberating in an era when women's psychological experiences were often dismissed. Others bristled at what they perceived as essentialist thinking that could be used to confine women to traditional roles. Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest colleagues, extended his work on feminine psychology while also critiquing aspects of his approach. Jung was the first to take women's psychological development seriously, von Franz once remarked, acknowledging how radical his attentiveness to women's inner lives had been. Yet even she recognized the cultural limitations that inevitably shaped his observations. The concept of the eternal feminine draws from deep cultural roots, particularly the German Romantic tradition that influenced Jung's intellectual development. Goethe's famous line, "Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan," the eternal feminine draws us upward, from Faust expressed a similar intuition about feminine energy as a transformative spiritual force. Jung expanded this poetic insight into a psychological framework with clinical applications. What remains striking about Jung's views is their paradoxical nature. He often described feminine consciousness as more holistic, relational, and connected to natural rhythms than masculine consciousness, which he characterized as more analytical, differentiated, and abstract. Yet he also insisted that true psychological development required the integration of opposites, suggesting that healthy development for women included strengthening precisely those masculine qualities of discrimination and abstract thought. Critics point out that Jung's observations about feminine psychology emerged primarily from working with middle and upper-class European women during a particular historical period. Their psychological struggles inevitably reflected the gender constraints and expectations of that social context. Would Jung have developed the same theories had he worked extensively with women from non-Western cultures or different social classes? Even more challenging is how Jung sometimes conflated biological, psychological, and cultural aspects of femininity. He moved fluidly between discussing women's bodies, social roles, and psychological patterns, as if these necessarily aligned, an approach that contemporary gender theory has thoroughly questioned. Yet Jung's insights about the power of archetypal patterns to shape experience, regardless of their ultimate origin, continue to resonate with many who find them validated in their own psychological lives. Perhaps Jung's most provocative suggestion was that modern women faced unique psychological dangers as they entered traditionally masculine domains. He worried that without proper integration of their animus, women might develop a false masculinity, becoming identified with logical thinking and autonomous action in ways that disconnected them from their deeper feminine wisdom. This created what he called animus possession, where a woman's consciousness becomes dominated by rigid thinking, cutting criticism, and a peculiar kind of destructiveness. This perspective leads to the uncomfortable question at the heart of Jung's views on women. Did he see something genuinely destructive in the feminine psyche that warranted special attention? Or was he simply reacting to women's increasing social emancipation in ways that pathologized their legitimate pursuit of equality? The truth likely contains elements of both, reflecting both Jung's remarkable psychological insights and his inevitable cultural limitations. Few aspects of Jung's psychology prove more controversial than his views on motherhood and maternal power. For Jung, the mother wasn't simply a biological role or social function, but a primal psychological force that shaped human development at its deepest level. His perspective on maternal influence, particularly its potential shadow aspects, contains some of his most challenging ideas about women and their impact on others. According to Jung, the mother archetype stands as perhaps the most powerful in the human psyche. It represents not just nurturing and protection, but also the capacity to devour, entrap, or stifle development. The loving mother, the terrible mother, Jung wrote, capturing this fundamental duality. This archetypal pattern manifests personally through each individual's relationship with their actual mother, but it also operates impersonally as a pattern we all carry as part of our psychological inheritance. What made Jung's observations particularly provocative was his insistence that mothers wielded enormous psychological power that often remained unacknowledged or denied. In an era when mothers were often idealized but rarely recognized as powerful agents, Jung documented how maternal influence could shape entire lives, sometimes constructively, sometimes destructively. This wasn't about moral judgment, but about recognizing the profound impact of early maternal relationships on psychological development. Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their children than the unlived life of the parent, Jung observed. He believed that mothers who hadn't developed their own individual potential often unconsciously manipulated their children to fulfill their unlived dreams or compensate for their unfulfilled needs. This dynamic created what he called psychic infection, an unconscious transfer of psychological material from mother to child that could burden the child with alien contents not properly their own. The devouring mother appears frequently. In Jung's case, studies, a woman who, often with the best intentions, unconsciously prevents her children, particularly sons, from achieving psychological separation and independence. Jung observed that such mothers frequently justified their over-involvement as love and protection while remaining blind to their unconscious need to maintain control. The sons of such mothers often developed particular psychological patterns, including difficulties with intimate relationships, challenges with authority, and struggles to find their own path in life. Jung's perspective becomes even more complicated when he discusses the special relationship between mothers and daughters. He suggested that mothers more easily projected unconscious content onto daughters than sons because of their greater psychological similarity. This created particular challenges for daughters' individuation process, the development of a differentiated, authentic self. Daughters might remain unconsciously identified with their mothers well into adulthood, struggling to distinguish their own desires, values, and life path from what had been implanted through this participation mystique with the maternal figure. What makes these observations so challenging is that they ascribe tremendous psychological influence to women in their maternal role, while simultaneously suggesting that this influence can become destructive when wielded unconsciously. Jung wasn't suggesting that mothers intentionally harmed their children, but rather that the unconscious dynamics between mother and child could create lasting psychological patterns that limited authentic development. Modern readers might question whether Jung unfairly focused on maternal influence while giving less attention to paternal impacts. There's some validity to this criticism, though Jung did write about the father complex and its effects. His emphasis on mothers likely reflected both his clinical observations and the social reality of his time, when mothers typically had far more involvement in children's early development than fathers. Beyond the personal mother-child relationship, Jung also believed that the feminine principle had a particular relationship to nature, matter, and unconscious life. Women, he suggested, maintained a more immediate connection to these realms than men typically did. This gave them access to powerful instinctual knowledge, but also meant they could become channels for unconscious forces in ways that could overwhelm rationality and conscious intention. The Animus possessed woman, Jung wrote in one particularly, Challenging passage unconsciously desires power over others and can become destructive when this desire remains unrecognized. This wasn't about moral evil, but about psychological patterns that developed when aspects of the psyche remained in shadow, unacknowledged and unintegrated. Jung's views on the shadow aspects of feminine psychology were balanced by his equally strong assertions about women's capacity for wisdom, healing, and spiritual insight. He documented numerous cases where women's intuitive capacities provided guidance that rational approaches couldn't access. He valued the feminine principle's connection to feeling, relatedness, and embodied wisdom, qualities he believed modern Western culture had dangerously devalued in its one-sided emphasis on masculine rationality and technological mastery. This dual perspective, acknowledging both the constructive and destructive potentials of feminine psychology, represents Jung's fundamental approach. He wasn't interested in simplistic idealization of women any more than in their denigration. Rather, he sought to understand the full spectrum of psychological possibilities, including those aspects that remained in shadow. Contemporary Jungian analysts have worked to extract the valuable clinical insights from Jung's observations while challenging aspects that seem culturally limited. They recognize that while certain psychological patterns may indeed appear with statistical frequency in clinical practice with mothers and children, these patterns reflect complex interactions between biology, psychology, culture, and individual development rather than essential feminine qualities. Perhaps nowhere does Jung's perspective on women and the feminine become more practically relevant than in his theories about romantic relationships. According to Jung, our attractions and conflicts with others, particularly those of the opposite sex, are governed largely by unconscious projections related to our internal anima and animus figures. This viewpoint offers both disturbing and liberating possibilities for understanding relationship dynamics. Jung observed that men typically project their anima, their inner feminine aspect, onto women they find attractive. A man might be drawn to a particular woman not primarily for who she actually is, but because she seems to embody qualities of his own unconscious feminine side. Similarly, women project their animus, their inner masculine aspect, onto men who seem to embody this internal figure. These projections create the intense emotional charge and fascination characteristic of romantic attraction. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, Jung wrote. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This transformation occurs partly because relationships force us to confront aspects of ourselves we've previously kept unconscious by seeing them mirrored or triggered by our partners. What makes Jung's perspective so challenging is his insistence that many relationship difficulties stem from these unconscious projections rather than from the actual personalities involved. When a man becomes irrationally angry or disappointed with a woman, Jung suggested, he's often reacting to ways she fails to match his anima projection rather than engaging with her authentic self. Similarly, a woman's frustration with a man might reveal more about her relationship with her own animus than about her partner's actual limitations. Jung documented how these projection mechanisms create predictable patterns in relationships. Initially, projection creates fascination and attraction as we seem to discover someone who perfectly embodies qualities we unconsciously seek. As the relationship develops, disappointment inevitably follows as the real person emerges from behind our projected image. This creates a crisis point where the relationship either dissolves or transforms into something more authentic as projections are gradually withdrawn and real relationship becomes possible. Every relationship has its optimal distance, Jung observed, challenging the romantic notion that complete merger represents relationship success. He believed that maintaining appropriate psychological boundaries actually allowed for deeper connection than relationships characterized by unconscious identification or projection. Jung's understanding of marriage was particularly revolutionary, and for his time, he viewed it not primarily as a social institution or even a love relationship, but as a container for psychological development. The love problem is part of mankind's heaviest problems, and no one should be surprised if a decisive effect comes not from an intellectual answer, but from an emotional development, he wrote. Marriage represented a psychological relationship where both partners faced the challenge of withdrawing projections and developing previously undeveloped aspects of themselves. What does this mean for Jung's view of women? He believed women typically projected qualities like independence, spiritual authority, objective thinking, and worldly effectiveness onto men through the Animus complex. When these projections remained unconscious, women might either idealize men who seemed to embody these qualities or become harshly critical of men who failed to match their inner image of masculine perfection. Conversely, Jung observed that men typically projected qualities like emotional depth, intuitive wisdom, relatedness, and beauty onto women through the anima complex. When these projections remained unconscious, men either idealized women who seemed to match this inner image or became irrationally disappointed and angry when real women failed to fulfill these unconscious expectations. Jung's perspective suggests that genuine relationship requires the gradual withdrawal of these projections and the development of these qualities within oneself. A woman must develop her own capacity for independent thought and action, rather than seeking these exclusively through men. A man must develop his own emotional depth and relatedness, rather than expecting women to carry these functions for him. This view challenges both traditional gender arrangements and certain modern assumptions. Jung didn't believe that men and women were psychologically identical or interchangeable, but he also didn't support rigid gender roles that prevented psychological development. His ideal was that each person would develop their full human potential, including aspects traditionally associated with the opposite gender, while maintaining their primary gender identity. Jung's observations about relationship patterns emerged from decades of clinical practice with couples in distress. He documented how women often unconsciously chose partners who embodied either positive or negative aspects of their father complex, recreating childhood dynamics in their adult relationships. Men similarly chose partners who reflected their mother complex. These unconscious choices created repetitive patterns that could only be broken through conscious awareness. Unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, Jung warned. This principle applies powerfully to relationship patterns, where unconscious projections and complexes create seemingly inevitable conflicts and disappointments that actually represent opportunities for greater consciousness. While Jung's perspectives on gender differences in relationship might seem outdated to contemporary readers, his core insight that relationships serve as mirrors for our own unconscious material remains profoundly relevant. Modern Jungian analysts have extended his work to include same-sex relationships and more fluid understandings of gender, while preserving his essential understanding of projection mechanisms and their role in both attraction and conflict. Break. Time threes. At the heart of Jung's controversial perspectives on women lies a radical proposition: the psychological journey toward wholeness, what he called individuation, might follow different paths for women and men. This suggestion challenges both traditional views that limited women's development and contemporary perspectives that assume identical developmental trajectories regardless of gender. Individuation in Jung's psychology represents the process of becoming one's authentic self by integrating conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. It involves facing one's shadow, denied or repressed aspects of personality, withdrawing projections from others, and ultimately connecting with the self, the organizing center and totality of the psyche that transcends the limited ego. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, Jung stated, capturing his belief that authentic psychological development represented life's central task. Yet he observed that this process often unfolded differently for women than for men, reflecting both psychological predispositions and cultural constraints. For men, Jung suggested, individuation typically involved reconnecting with qualities they had repressed or projected onto women. Emotional sensitivity, relatedness, intuition, and connection to unconscious processes. The man's task involved integrating his anima, his inner feminine, without losing his masculine identity. For women, Jung proposed a more complex and contentious developmental path that he believed reflected women's unique psychological starting point. Women, he suggested, typically began with stronger connections to unconscious processes, natural rhythms, and relational awareness than most men. Their individuation often required developing greater psychological separation, objective thinking, and spiritual autonomy, qualities associated with the animus or masculine principle. A woman's conscious life has traditionally been lived within the bounds of her relationship to men, Jung observed, noting how cultural factors had often limited women's psychological development. He believed that many women unconsciously lived through men rather than developing their own authentic connection to meaning, purpose, and spiritual authority. What makes Jung's perspective particularly challenging is his suggestion that women's psychological development naturally tends to accelerate in the second half of life, after child-rearing responsibilities diminish. Only then, he suggested, do many women fully confront the task of developing their own individual identity, separate from roles as daughters, wives, and mothers. Men, by contrast, often face their major psychological crisis in midlife, when achievement-oriented consciousness proves insufficient for deeper fulfillment. This gendered developmental timeline reflected both biological realities and the cultural conditions of Jung's era. Contemporary Jungian analysts have questioned whether these patterns still apply in societies where women's life choices have greatly expanded. Yet many continue to observe gender differences in how psychological development unfolds, even while acknowledging the complex interplay of biological, psychological, and cultural factors. Jung documented how women's psychological development often involved confronting particular challenges, differentiating from over-identification with the mother, developing autonomous judgment rather than relying on collective values, and establishing direct rather than mediated connections to spiritual meaning. These challenges reflected both internal psychological patterns and external cultural limitations that often constrained women's development. The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents, Jung wrote in a passage with particular relevance for women's development. He observed how mothers who hadn't individuated often unconsciously prevented their daughters from exceeding the boundaries of their own development. Breaking this unconscious contract required particular courage and often triggered powerful guilt that could derail the individuation process. Jung's female colleagues, including Marie-Louise von Franz, Esther Harding, and later Marion Woodman, extended his observations about women's psychological development, while challenging aspects they found limited by cultural bias. They documented how women's dreams and active imagination often revealed inner masculine figures, expressions of the animus that evolved through identifiable stages as women individuated. The initial stages often involved primitive or undeveloped animus figures, aggressive or threatening men, seductive tricksters, or rigid authoritarian figures representing unconscious masculine energies. As individuation progressed, these figures transformed into more differentiated expressions: the man of action, the artist or spiritual seeker, and ultimately the wise inner companion representing objective truth and meaning. Jung believed that a woman's relationship with her inner masculine aspects, her animus, dramatically shaped her engagement with the outer world and with actual men. A woman with an undifferentiated animus might remain caught in unconscious identification with male authority figures, rebellious opposition to all masculine principle, or cycles of idealization and bitter disappointment in relationships. As her animus developed, she gained access to qualities like objective judgment, independent action, and spiritual authority without sacrificing her feminine consciousness. What makes Jung's perspective so challenging to contemporary sensibilities is his insistence that psychological wholeness looks different for women than for men, not because of arbitrary social conventions, but because of what he perceived as fundamental psychological differences. Women's consciousness, he believed, naturally tended toward wholeness, connection, and inclusion, while men's consciousness more naturally tended toward differentiation, abstraction, and separation. Psychological health meant developing the counter-tendency without abandoning one's primary mode of consciousness. Modern critics question whether these observed differences reflected essential psychological truths, or simply the cultural conditioning of Jung's era. Jung himself acknowledged the difficulty of separating archetypal patterns from their cultural expressions, but maintained that certain psychological differences between men and women transcended cultural variation. Contemporary Jungian practice tends to approach these questions with greater flexibility, recognizing the immense variation within gender categories while still acknowledging patterns that appear with statistical frequency in clinical practice. Perhaps Jung's most valuable contribution regarding women's individuation was his insistence that psychological development continues throughout the lifespan, with particularly important phases in midlife and beyond. At a time when women's value was often tied primarily to youth and reproductive capacity, Jung documented how many women experience profound psychological awakening and creative flowering in their post-menopausal years. He saw this as neither coincidental nor merely compensatory, but as reflecting the natural rhythm of feminine psychological development. Life really does begin at 40, Jung remarked, with particular reference to women's psychological development. Up until then, you are just doing research. This perspective offered both challenge and profound hope to women navigating the journey toward authentic selfhood in a culture that often limited their psychological horizons. Has Jung's perspective on women's psychological development stood the test of time? The answer remains deeply contested. His recognition of feminine wisdom, embodied knowledge, and alternative developmental pathways continues to inspire many. His tendency to naturalize certain gender differences and his occasionally sweeping generalizations about feminine psychology rightly trigger criticism, yet beneath the cultural limitations of his era lies an enduring insight. The journey towards psychological wholeness engages both universal human patterns and the particular starting points shaped by our biological and cultural inheritance. See you on the other side. Take care and see you later.